Please be seated. You know, one of the things that I've kind of put together and began to realize over the last 20 years of ministry is that probably for most people there are two fears. First of all, there's the fear of dying tonight. But then also there is the fear of living tomorrow. And there may be some of you here this morning who can relate to that. I mean, you're absolutely terrified at the thought of dying tonight. And then there are some of you who are absolutely terrified at the thought of living for tomorrow because for you, living has no passion. Look with me though at Philippians chapter 1, verses 21 through 26. Because Paul had a different philosophy when it came to living and dying. And you have to understand when and where Paul was writing this. Paul was actually writing this from a Roman prison. And he was writing this during a time when he didn't know if tomorrow he was going to live or if tomorrow he was going to die. But this was his view of life and death. Notice what he says. He says, "For to me to live is what, church? Is Christ. And to die is what? Gain. If I go on living in the body, this will mean fruitful labor for me. Yet what shall I choose? I do not know. I am torn between the two. I desire to depart and to be with Christ, which is what, church? Better by far, but it is more necessary for you that I should remain in the body. Convinced of this, I know that I will remain, and I will continue with all of you for your progress and joy in the faith, so that through my being with you again, your joy in Christ Jesus will overflow on account of me." Okay, so notice, Paul has a different outlook on life and death, right? He says, you know, I really struggle between the two. He said, I mean, if I get to live any longer, if I get one more day longer on this earth, he says it is great because I get to live my life here for Jesus Christ. But he says, if I am to die tomorrow, if something were to happen to me tonight, it would be even better because I know if I die, guess what? I get to be with Jesus Christ. You hear what Paul is saying? It is a win-win situation for me as a Christian. It's kind of like taking your cat to a veterinarian that's also a taxidermist. I mean, either way, you get your cat back, right? I mean, it's a win-win situation. And that's the way it is with those of us who are Christians. But let's look deeper into this philosophy. Let's talk about living, because I think that there are some who, man, when they think about life, it's kind of discouraging because they have no purpose. They have no meaning. I'm sure there are some of you who know people like that, or maybe I'm speaking to you this morning. I mean, as you look at your life, you're like, man, is this really all there is? Some of you remember Peggy Lee had an old song entitled that. Is this all there is? You know, you work hard for an extra degree, and then you work hard for that promotion. And then you work hard to obtain that house in the suburbs, and you work hard to reach retirement. But then by the time you get to the end of life, it's just like, man, I don't feel any better than when I started. Is this really all there is? You see, the problem with most people is not that they don't have enough to live on. The problem with most people is that they don't have enough to live for. In fact, I would dare say that for the majority of the people who walk the face of this earth, this would be their philosophy for living. To live is all about me. And let me tell you something, if that's all you are living for, that is a very small and minute thing to live for. And I am telling you, at the end of the road, what you will find and what you will discover is emptiness. There was a brilliant physicist by the name of Robert Oppenheimer. And 1 year before he died, he told friends and family, he said, "I am a complete failure." Now, you have to understand, this guy was absolutely brilliant. He graduated from Princeton University. He also headed up the project for the atomic bomb. I mean, you're talking about a guy that is absolutely brilliant. And now towards the end of his life, he says, "I am a complete failure." And his friends and family were telling him, "But look at all you have done." And this is what he said, "Yes, but they only leave on the tongue the taste of ashes." Isn't that sad, man? Wouldn't it be terrible to live 60, 70, 80 years on this planet, to look back at your life and say, "Man, I can't account for anything that really matters." But Paul couldn't say that. Paul says, man, if I go on living this life, it's going to bear fruit. And some of you are asking, well, what do you mean? What does he mean by bearing fruit? Well, if you look at verses 24 through 26, 5 times in our text, he mentions the word "you." In other words, Paul says, I go on living with passion because God has given me a purpose. He has given me a meaning for this life, and it is to go on living for you. If I have one more day on this earth, I have one more day that I can tell people about Jesus. If I have one more day on this earth, I have an opportunity to bring the joy of Jesus to someone else. I have a passion, I have a purpose, I have a meaning because of you. You know, I think that's one of the reasons why there's so much depression today. Is because many times we're not living life for others. We're living life for self. This preoccupation with self. But let me ask you a question this morning. Why did God leave us on this earth? I mean, after He sent His Son, Jesus Christ, to come and to die for our sins, why didn't He just take us on home after that? You ever thought about that? You ever thought about, okay, why am I still here? And what I would say to all of us is we're still here because God knew that someone else still needs us. In fact, you may want to write this in on your outline. Life in these bodies will never be joyful as long as we look only to our own interests and not to the interest of others. There's someone here who needs you. I love what one old preacher prayed one time. He said, "Give me people that I can bless with Jesus Christ, or Lord, take me on home to see Jesus." And that's what we're called to, right? I mean, if you look at 2 Corinthians chapter 5, verse 20, Paul refers to us as ambassadors. Ambassadors for the King. Now, what does an ambassador do? Well, an ambassador leaves his home and he goes to another country to serve the king, to do whatever the king wanted him to do in this other country. Now this other country is not his home, and he's only there for a little while, and he will stay there as long as there is something that the king has for him to do. Paul says, I'm an ambassador. He said, I can tell you what I wish, man. I wish I could go home. But if my King has got something for me to do, He says, I want to stay. And you and I, we're ambassadors for Christ. We're here to serve the King. We're here to bring the good news and the joy of Jesus into the lives of those around us. I love Philippians chapter 2, verses 3 through 4. I mean, same book, and Paul deals with this very same thing. He says, look, do nothing out of selfish ambition or vain conceit. Rather, in humility, value others above yourself, not looking to your own interests, but each of you to the interests of others. In other words, if you want a purpose, if you want a meaning for your life, stop looking at yourself. Stop living for self and start living for others. Start living for God. Start living to share God with those around you. Because you see, here's the deal. The quality of our life really does depend upon our investments. Someday we're going to stand before the Lord and give an account of how we used every day that was a gift from Him. And the question is, one day when we stand before the Lord, what are we going to have to show? I mean, after 70, 80 years, are we going to say, Lord, man, look at this big house that I built. And Lord, look at this nice car that I have. And Lord, look at all this stuff that I have attained. Now, we're not going to be able to say that because let me tell you, when the Lord returns, all that stuff's going to be obliterated. It's going to be gone. And so we want to invest in something that's eternal, right? Every day we live is a gift of grace from God to be used to invest in people, and that will live on. I don't know how many of you know the name Patrick Morley. I believe he lives here in Florida, Winter Park actually. He's actually a well-known Christian author. He writes a lot of books about men and their relationship with God. But anyway, Patrick talks about how when him and his wife, started out, they, decided they wanted to go into business for themselves. And man, they started out working this business and it was really hard work. And then over time, things began to pick up and they began to make really good money. And so they started becoming a part of this organization and that organization and going here and going there and building their status. And he said, man, one day, he said, I came home and I looked at my wife and he said, honey, he said, we have arrived. And he said, she humbled me by looking at me and saying, yes, we've arrived, but in the wrong place. And she said, it's time to reprioritize our lives. And so he said, that night we sat down and we began to reprioritize, and we did it by asking this question: who is going to cry at our funeral? He said, because let me tell you something. He said, one day, you may have all this stuff and you may have this huge funeral where lots of people are going to show up and they're going to talk about your greatness and how successful you are. But he said, the question came down to this: who's going to cry at your funeral? Who is going to cry because now they are missing a major source of joy in their life? Let me ask you a question this morning. Who are you a joy to? Man, who are you serving? Who are you encouraging in the Lord? I tell you, man, this past week, one of the things that the elders and myself, we do before our worship begins is we'll go back to my office and we will pray about our worship. And 2 weeks ago, we were getting ready to pray, and we were sitting there, and all of a sudden, I heard Dana Robertson come in. And she came back to my office, and there we were just kind of sitting around, and it was awesome. You know, she turned and she looked at Danny, and she said, Danny, she said, man, aren't you just filled with joy? She said, because let me tell you something. She said, Danny, Jesus Christ died for you. And Danny said, amen. And I mean, she was just bubbling over with this excitement and this joy and this passion for living. Where did that come from? It's the same source of joy that came from Paul. And that's Jesus. You know, when we have Jesus, we can have passion, we can have joy for our lives, and we can pass that joy on. That's why we're here, to extend and pass that joy on to others. Who are you a joy to? Because you see, the best use of our life is to invest in something that will last forever. And only Christ can give life that much meaning. But there's another side of that story, right? Dying. And man, this is the part that people hate to talk about. Man, I don't want to talk about dying. And as a preacher, I have to deal with this a lot because I'm the guy that people will call, you know, to do funerals and so forth. And some of the comments that you will hear people make, even Christians, is this: well, they're probably better off. Or man, this is just so sad. And so oftentimes I want to look at these people, especially those who are mourning over the loss of someone who is a Christian. And I understand there's a period of mourning, but there's also a side of us that has to say, this is a good thing. These people are better off. It's not a probably. In fact, I love the way Paul put it in verse 23. We don't think about death this way, but I love the way he put it. I desire to depart and be with Christ because it is what? Wait a second. It's what? It is better. Are you kidding me, Paul? Are you kidding me? It is better. Death is better than living. And Paul says, you better believe it. Because I get to be with Jesus. Man, this week, or actually last week, I found out someone who is very dear to my family is just eaten up with cancer. When we were at Robertsdale, there was a woman who, from the time we got there 14 years ago, who just took us into her home and just made us her family. And she became basically like a grandparent to me and my kids. And we called her Nana, and we called her husband Papa. And you talk about an outstanding Christian lady. And man, she just had this joy for the Lord, and she, you know, she was excited to one day go home and be with the Lord. And so the family, they call and they tell Julie and I that, you know, she's in this last stages of cancer. You know, they've gone in and they found that it's just all over her body, and they're only giving her so many months to live. And so anyway, I call Nana up on the phone, and man, she's just in good spirits. And she sits there and she tells me what's going on. She said, yeah, they're only giving me so many months to live. But man, there's no remorse. There's no poor, pitiful me in any of this conversation. And we just talk and we reminisce. And she said, I just want you to know, she said, I love you and your family so much. And I was getting ready to ask her to do, I've never done this before. I've always wanted to ask someone who was in the final stages of death. I wanted to ask her to do something for me. But right before I got to ask her to do this for me, she said, hey, She said, I'm just getting tired. She said, talk to my daughter Macy, and I'm very close to Macy as well. And so me and Macy, we sat there, and she took me through the whole process of what's going on. Hospice has been called in. She's there 24/7 herself. And I said, well, Macy, I said, I just got to tell you, I said, as long as I've known your mom, I said, she's always wanted to go and be with Jesus. And she said, I know. And I told her, I said, man, I wanted to ask her to do something for me. But I said, she passed the phone over to where I didn't get to ask us. I've never asked this of anyone before, but I know what's going to take place when she passes. And she said, well, what's that? And I said, I wanted to ask her, if she were to die before me, when she gets to heaven, would she just tell Jesus, I said hello and give him a big hug, and I can't wait to see him. That's the kind of outlook on death we should have. Man, I get to be with Jesus. I get to see Jesus. You look at this word depart, and it's kind of an interesting word. The Greeks used it to describe when they would sleep in tents. I mean, this tent, it wasn't their home. They would just sleep in these tents till they could get where they had to go. And each morning before they would go, they would break the tent down, and then they would, start pushing toward wherever they needed to go. And in a similar sense, Paul is saying, these are just tents. And our old bodies, they're going to get old and they're going to break down. They're not meant to be permanent. In fact, in 2 Corinthians chapter 5, verses 1 and 2, he says, now we know that if the earthly tent we live in is destroyed, talking about our bodies, we have a building from God, an eternal house in heaven, not built by human hands. Meanwhile, we groan, longing to be clothed with our heavenly dwellings. Is that how you feel? I mean, when you think about the thought of going to heaven and being with Jesus, do you get homesick? Because Paul says, listen, when these tents are torn down, that's not the end. We get to be with Jesus. Now, some of you this morning, you may not fully understand that. Some of you are probably asking, man, why in the world would Paul choose to die? Why would he say that dying was far, far better? Because Paul was absolutely obsessed with Jesus. He was so in love with Jesus that at the thought of being with Him, it just made his heart ache. But he says, if I stay here, he says, then I can bring joy to you. If I stay here, then I can share that joy of Jesus with you. Let me share with you, before we close out, 3 things we need to remember. First of all, we need to remember the certainty of our salvation. Man, if you want to live a life of passion, if you don't want to fear and dread eternity, then know that as Christians, we can have salvation through Jesus Christ. Paul was absolutely sure of that. It's not like the astronaut, right, who after he got back from his space travel on the moon, a reporter pulled him to the side and he said, what were you thinking up there? I mean, as you were walking on the moon, as you looked up and you saw that little bitty blue ball that we call Earth, he says, what were you thinking? To which the astronaut said, I just remember thinking our spacecraft was built by the lowest bidder. A little bit of uncertainty there. Before we make a long trip, before we go on a journey, we want to make sure before we get started that we're going to make it. We're going to end up where we want to go. Paul said, thanks to Jesus, I know where I'm heading. I know where I'm going to go. When I say goodbye, I'm going to be with Him. In fact, I love this passage. John writes this in 1 John chapter 5, verse 13. He says, I write these things to you who believe in the name of the Son of God, so that you may what, church? So that you may what, church? So that you may what, church? Know that you have what? Eternal life. Paul says, I know. And man, when you know, that gives you a new passion for living and dying, right? But then something else that we need to remember is the necessity of service. Because you see, here's the thing that we have to realize. Life is not measured by duration, but by donation. What are we doing with our life that's going to matter forever? There was a guy by the name of Louis Pasteur. Some of you probably remember him. He was famous for coming up with a cure for rabies. Because thousands of people during his lifetime were dying of this disease. And so at the point where he thought that he had the cure, there was a 9-year-old boy by the name of Joseph Minster who was bitten by a rabid dog that had rabies. And his mother came to Louis Pasteur and said, please, please, please give my son this cure that you're working on. And for 10 days, he took Joseph in and he gave him shots. And guess what? He lived. And years later, before Louis Pasteur was about to die, after years of awards and honors, someone asked what he would like to have written on his tombstone. And he said just three words: Joseph Minster lived. What are we doing with our life that's going to matter forever? Use the gift of life that God has given you to be a gift to someone else. But then lastly, one other thing we need to remember is the security of our sacrifice. Paul says here, listen, I'm willing to give up everything that I have for Jesus. I love Him with all my heart, with all my soul, with all my mind, with all my strength. You sang that yourself this morning. And you know what Paul says? When I die, it will be a gain. Now let me tell you this morning, I'm not a business major. Okay? But I do know enough to know this: the only way something can be a gain is if the reward you get is bigger than the investment that you put forth, right? And so Paul is saying, nothing we can give to Jesus. There is nothing that we can give to Jesus that's not going to be a gain. In short, there is no safer investment that we can make with our life than to spend our life on Jesus. Listen to me this morning. I guarantee you, you will never regret being obsessed with Jesus. In Lewis Carroll's Alice in Wonderland, Alice asked the Cheshire Cat, "Would you tell me, please, which way I ought to go from here?" The Cheshire Cat replies, "Well, that depends a good deal on where you want to get to." "I don't much care where," Alice said. "Then it doesn't matter which way you go," the Cheshire Cat replied. "You're sure to get somewhere if you only walk long enough." Let me ask you a question this morning. Where do you want to get to? If you want to get to heaven and be with Jesus, then you need to consider this question: what am I living for? In fact, it'd be great. I should have wrote this on your outline. For me to live is, and then you fill in the blank. For me to live, some might say money. For me to live, would be my family. For me to live would be self. For me to live, happiness, pleasure, fun. I mean, there's all kinds of things that we could put in the blank. But Paul says, for me to live is Christ. And when we live for Christ, then we know that in death, it's a gain. If you guys would, play that video for me in closing this morning. After this, we're going to offer the invitation. I believe Wayne Stoltz showed this on Wednesday night in one of our Bible classes. It's an illustration that Francis Chan uses. And let them play this time.
Now imagine that this rope is a timeline of your existence. You just exist forever. You see this red part? This would represent your time on earth. You've got a few short years here on earth, and then you've got all of eternity somewhere else. This is your existence. And what blows me away is some of you, all you think about is this red part. It's all you think about. You're consumed with this. You go, oh man, I can't wait till here. You know, I'm going to work hard. I'm going to save so I can really enjoy this part right here. And you're consumed with that. And you're thinking, oh man, am I going to get to travel? Am I going to eat well? Am I going to do this during this part? And I'm like, are you kidding me? What about this? What about this? What about that? What about all this stuff that's just, it's crazy to me because the Bible teaches that what I do during this little red part determines how I'm going to exist for millions and millions and millions of years forever.
And so the question is to you this morning, what are you living for? It may be that some of you decide today, man, I'm ready to live for Jesus. Because you see, it's only the life of Jesus that offers us this eternity with God. And it may be that there are some of you this morning, you need to come forward and say, man, I'm ready to come to Jesus. I'm ready to put Him on in baptism, having all my sins completely washed away. Or it may be that there are some of you here today who, you know what, you're a Christian, and it's time that you begin to realize you're a Christian. And that this is your opportunity now to be a joy to someone, to share Jesus with someone. To have someone look at your life and say, man, I want that too. And it may be that there are some of you who, man, you need prayers, you need help with that because this life, it's tough. This life can be a struggle, especially to stay focused on the reality that there is an end. And so this morning, if you need to respond for any reason, won't you come as together we stand as we sing.